want to talk a little bit more about subversion as one of the major functions of parables. And then I want to move to listing some other purposes. I think that the primary purpose of parables come out in their various functions. But we might want to make a list of other kinds of things that they do. But let me work on subversion again. It's just gotten to be a much more significant thing to me through the years of studying these things. A fellow by the name of Leland Ryken wrote a book called, with some other helpers, The Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. As you might guess from the title, part of the article there is going to be on parables, no doubt. This is what he says about subversion in parables. Whatever the foreground theme of a parable is, therefore, there is often a deep structural element of subversion at work, by which conventional ways of viewing reality and or valuing things in calling into question. The general import of this technique is to announce that the kingdom Christ announces is based on new values, with special emphasis on divine grace as opposed to human merit. So what Ryken is saying is, even in the midst of the story element of the parable, and even amidst its various functions or purposes, always going under the radar, or always like an iceberg, more under the water than above the water, something else is taking place. I don't want to be too mystical about this. I don't want to make this harder than it is. I don't want us to look for stuff in the text that's not there by the author's design. And yet by the same token, I think Ryken is probably right, that usually underneath something else is happening that quite frankly may be beyond our mental ability to know exactly what that something is. So first of all, I want to raise the question of what might Jesus be subverting? I mean, his world was different than ours. We're removed by it, from 2,000 years of history. It was a totally different language, totally different culture, totally different geography. So in the world in which Jesus came, the Middle East, and there's probably a reason why God brought Jesus to the Middle East, because it really is the connecting point of East meeting West. It's the middle of the world. That little 150 miles of geographical strip of land there between East and West is a very pivotal place in the world. That world, it was so different than ours. What was Jesus trying to subvert? Well, I'd like to give you a list of 5 things that he might have been having to allow to run under the radar. The first is the realm of politics. Now, people get nervous when Christians start mixing that into their speech, but the Bible, quite frankly, is a very political book, and Jesus was a king, and when you raise the issue of Jesus being a king and having a kingdom, you've entered into the realm of politics, if you will. And for Jesus, the realm of politics was this, that his people he came to and ministered to were oppressed. They were under Roman occupation. In fact, in the biblical story, they've spent more time under other people's oppression than on top of their game. And so part of what you might see underneath the parables, subverting the theme is this issue of oppression. Jesus is speaking to an oppressed people. And therefore, if the parables highlight themes of liberation and freedom, it shouldn't surprise us. He's subverting the political process. Second is the cultural subversion. Many of the parables that Jesus uses are what we would call agrarian. If he was in Tarsus, where Paul grew up, if he was in Athens, or if he was in Rome, he might have used a different method. But many of the parables deal with fishing and farming and gathering taxes and things like that, because his situation is agrarian. I guess in part you could say Jesus knows his audience. He knows what he's talking about. But underneath that as well, there might be running something that says, when God's people do things God's way, there will be no ra'av, the Hebrew word for famine. There'll be no famine in the land. God will take care of them. So if there's a land that's being productive, that says one thing in the parable. If there's land being unproductive, that says something else in the parable. Jesus is subverting the cultural agrarian context. Here's the third thing. Certainly Jesus is subverting some aspects of their society, the social element. And I'll mention 2 of them that are pretty evident. One is the issue of shame and honor. I don't think it's possible to overstate this. I suppose we have to still be careful, and I will offer a caution that we should not let the background be the foreground. But the whole way the ancient world thought about shame and honor affects just about every interpretive issue I know. The last thing you would do would be bring shame on your family. You would probably even lie to not bring shame on your family. On the other hand, what gets to be honored by society, such as religious elite people, people on the top of the economic spectrum perhaps, Jesus will subvert that. So shame and honor, how that works in a culture. And then also, and I just alluded to it, the issue of riches. The rich and the poor. Jesus will often in his parables invert those. That it's the poor guys that have it all together. It's the rich guys that have to be deposed. And so once again, even if the parable is about the grace of God, he might illustrate it with rich and poor. And in the end, he's subliminally, I guess you'd say, subverting some of their cultural and social values. Here's a fourth area, and that is religiously. Religiously. And what I mean by that is Jesus will use in his stories the elite, the religious elite, the religion police, making sure everybody follows the letter of the law, versus the people of the land. There was a Hebrew expression that goes like this. It's just called the Am Haaretz, the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. And many times it will say, especially the New International Version does this quite often. It'll use the word sinners, and it'll put the word sinners in quotation marks. And it simply means by that these aren't necessarily morally reprobate type people. These are people that just maybe didn't care enough about the Pharisaical rules of righteous living. And so they're just the people of the land. They were disrespected by the religious elite. Well, certainly, Jesus might be teaching on humility or various kinds of themes, but if he features a Pharisee, if he features a publican, he's trying to subvert something there. He's trying to flip something upside down. So religiously, it's sort of the religious elite versus the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. Fifthly, he will do this racially, and that should surprise no one. Now, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus had olive-colored skin. Around him were hosts of Gentile people, and if they were far enough from the West, they would probably look more like Anglos, I suppose. But the point is, you have Jew, you have Gentile, you have Samaritan. Those were various ethnicities. And Jesus will maybe not name them so much, though he does with the parable of what we call the Good Samaritan. He might not name the ethnicities, but for instance, he will say things like, this vineyard will be taken from you, and he's talking to the Jewish people there in the context, and will be given to a nation producing the fruit of it. Well, he doesn't name the Gentiles, but he's clearly referring to the Gentiles. And so again, you have some of this stuff kind of running under the radar, but it's clearly, Jesus might be teaching any number of truths, but he's trying in his way to get the world right side up. He's trying to move the world from creation in its fallen state to new creation. This is how heaven and earth really look when they cooperate instead of just collide. So that's what he might be subverting. Now, how does this subversion work? There are two ways I want to mention that this subversion works. One is by drawing upon common images. Jesus has some, what you might call stock images that he draws upon. Now, partly because he wants the people to track with him and follow him. But he will use language they understand. He will use situations they get. As we've suggested earlier, he'll use true-to-life comparisons, things that make sense to them. So he will draw upon stock images, things that they already had a reservoir in the back of their brain from which to draw for this to make sense. For instance, I guess you could say that Jesus is speaking the language of the customer. He's trying to relate to them as he starts out of the blocks. A man had 2 sons. Okay, this is language that they would understand. In fact, more than one person in parable studies has observed that the main characters oftentimes have various roles already pre-assigned in the lives of the people of that age. For instance, more than one scholar has noticed that fathers, kings, landowners, people like that, they often play the God role in the stories. In fact, they did it before Jesus got here. In the rabbinic parables, landowners, kings, fathers, all played the God role. We'll refer here in a minute to the parable, at least I think it's probably a parable, though I'm willing to entertain that it might be a real story, of Lazarus and the rich man. Okay? the person that plays the God role in the story is Abraham. Now, there's a reason that Abraham plays the role of God, admitting people into heaven and not admitting people into heaven. It's because people in that day, stock image, they thought of Abraham sitting at the gates and declaring who can come into the presence of God and who can't. So Jesus uses that to connect with him. But here's you use a common image, but what happens then? Secondly, you make uncommon connections. Uncommon connections. In other words, you flip-flop what they know to be true and ideal and the norm in their society. You flip it around, and that's where the subversion takes place. What I'd like to do is show this with a few examples, if I could. And one of the most obvious ones in this regard is, of course, what we call the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, nobody in Jesus' day would have called it the parable of the Good Samaritan. As far as the Jewish people were concerned, the only Good Samaritan was a dead Samaritan. So this is not the case at all in terms of how they would think of what was good. But watch how Jesus will take a common situation and he'll turn it around, make an uncommon connection. And this becomes sort of his subversion technique. So I'm just going to go to this very familiar story. I suppose after the prodigal son, this is the second most well-known parable of Jesus. We read in Luke 10:25 these words, "And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test." Now already, Luke the narrator is telling us we've got a problem. If you put Jesus to the test, my hunch is he's going to get an A. All right? And second, he will battle away to where before you're done, he gets the A and you flunk. And that's what we'll see here. So the lawyer, this would be an expert in Jewish law, maybe even an expert in Roman law. He said, "Teacher, what must I do? What shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, the question itself is problematic. Normally, one doesn't usually do anything to inherit something. That's what somebody else does. Even the way the guy has framed up his question, you recognize a difficulty. Sometimes when we ask questions, we indicate more about ourselves than we do about the content of the question itself. What must I do? When you usually don't do anything. Somebody else does something for you. So is there already in this guy kind of a works righteousness or a desire to pull himself up by his own bootstraps, walk up to heaven's gate, knock on the door and say, "Okay, here I am, where do I sit?" That kind of thing. So Jesus responds, what's written in the law? The master teacher answers a question with a question. And he does this oftentimes. In fact, somebody has counted the number of times that Jesus asked questions. And it's really an incredible amount in his encounters with people. What's written in the law? How do you read it? Maybe Jesus is interested in how you read the Bible. He wrote it through the power of his Holy Spirit. He's interested in how you understand it. And the man answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind." Okay, that's Deuteronomy 6, the famous Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love him with everything." He gets that right. "And your neighbor is yourself." That's the code of holiness out of Leviticus. So this lawyer is sharp enough to know Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 18:19. He's got this down. Those are high water marks of the Old Testament. Now this is all the setup to the story. And oftentimes we'll see that these parables have a rather significant setup. And so Jesus says to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." So love is evidently something one does. Loving God, loving neighbor. But here comes the issue. He's trying to test Jesus, but here's what else he's trying to do. But he, desiring to justify himself. Oh, that's a problem. If you come to church to test Jesus, if you come to church to justify yourself, let me guarantee something. You will leave church unchanged. That's just a flat fact. It will happen. He says, well, who is my neighbor? You see, he wants to draw the lines. And Jesus will tell this parable to blow the doors off of any definition of love that would limit its scope and its intensity. Who is my neighbor? He says. Jesus said, unlike how I would have done it, I would have said, well, the Hebrew word for neighbor is, and everybody would have fallen asleep. But Jesus says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. I'll have to come back later and talk about the word down. But from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, let's just stop right there. Because in the next phrase, Jesus is going to operate this principle of subversion. Everybody in his world because they had common images, common stock images in their head. They're not ready for this uncommon connection. If a priest, and priests and Levites were basically the teachers of Israel and the butchers of the sacrifice. They spent all their days slitting the throats of animals, draining out the blood, and offering sacrifice to God, in addition to teaching. Well, if a priest happens to pass by, that's one thing. If a Levite passes by from the tribe of Levi, clear back to the patriarch, that's one thing. So everybody knows, okay, I get it. I know where this is going. The priest, the Levite, but an Israelite, just a common Israelite covenant person, sees the dude in the ditch and goes to him and tries to help. Jesus takes the common image but makes an uncommon connection with this phrase. But a Samaritan. And everybody must have thought, Ethel, get the kids, we're going home. That's a shocking thing. A Samaritan. Why, they'd spit twice. And not every scholar agrees with this, but some believe that this happened in 722 BC when the Assyrians came from the north and hauled off some of the 10 northern tribes and brought in their people, the intermarriage, and thus the Samaritans. There's about 600 of them still alive today. They live in the Gaza Strip in Israel. They still sacrifice lambs at Passover time. 1954, National Geographic ran an article on Samaritans. At that time, there were about 450 of them. But Jesus in the former chapter has been refused lodging by a Samaritan village. Why would he make the Samaritan the hero of the story? If you skip over to a miracle story, not unlike parables, in Luke chapter 17, the guy that comes back after being healed, cleansed of his leprosy, is a Samaritan. And Jesus says, was no one fit to come back and say thank you except this foreigner? What's Jesus doing? He's underlining ethnicity. And in doing so, he's subverting how people think. He's trying to correct how they think, because so goes the brain, so goes the behavior. So the Samaritan comes to where he was, and he saw him and had compassion. I love this Greek word. It's splachnidzomai. Kind of sounds like you're throwing up your socks. It means something in the visceral level. He felt it right in the gut. He went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal, brought him to the inn, and took care of him. The next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him. Whatever more you spend, I'll repay you when I come back. And then Jesus, putting the interrogative at the end of the parable, says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves or robbers? And the man said, the one who showed, this is very interesting to me, mercy. Just like the miracle stories use salvation language, mercy is a salvation word. God's chesed from the Old Testament, his loving kindness, his covenantal love. This is a salvation type of word. The one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, go and do thou likewise. I hope you see the point. I can't take that much time to develop the other examples, though I will refer to them. But Jesus is doing his best to subvert how they think. And he'll start with common images so that they're nodding their head, amen, brother, amen. And then he makes uncommon connections, and it throws their world. It's like a smack in the back of the head. Well, he will do this in other places as well. In fact, Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 20. In Luke 12, Jesus is preaching probably to the largest crowd he ever had in his entire ministry. And a guy interrupts him. Now, that would seem strange to us in our world, but in Jesus' world, the preaching and teaching in the ancient world was much more dialogical. People would interrupt occasionally. And so the guy says, tell my brother to divide the inheritance between me and he. And Jesus says, who made me arbiter? But he went on to tell a parable about a guy who had too many crops. So he said, I will tear down my barns, I will build bigger ones, and then I can say, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. What Jesus is subverting there, though, is look at the personal pronouns. I, my, me, mine. That wouldn't do anything to Americans, because what drives our culture is individual rights. Most cultures of the world are not that way. They're much more communal. And Kenneth Bailey and others commenting on that particular parable would say, see, the problem was you would never in a village like that tear down your barn and build a bigger one without consulting the community of faith. It just wouldn't be done. Jesus is subverting a community value that the guy in his selfishness has eradicated. So that's chapter 12. In chapter 16, the very famous Lazarus and the rich man. If I might just refer to that story. Again, some people, because Jesus names Lazarus, and he doesn't do that in any of the other stories, and it doesn't label it as a parable, some suggest it's not a parable. But I would argue that has all the parabolic elements. And Lazarus is named 4 times in the story for a reason. You see, Abraham will play the God role. Abraham had a servant in the Old Testament named Eliezer. Eliezer's name means the Lord helped. And guess what the New Testament name for Eliezer is? Lazarus. The story, in part, is that God helps those who can't help themselves. I don't know that Lazarus and the rich man tells us a whole lot about the afterlife. We often use it that way. Oh, it's flames, and you'll see people in heaven, the great chasm fixed in between. I'd be careful of pressing those details. I think what that story is telling us is that you better use your worldly goods, your coin life now to take care of people, or there will be the grand reversal in the judgment. Luke has a lot of emphasis about money and taking care of the poor, and so it seems to even fit his emphasis. So once again, the economic thing is being subverted. Likewise in chapter 15, Luke 15, I'll save that for later. In Luke 18, 9 through 14, there's the story about the Pharisee and the publican, the Pharisee and the tax gatherer. Now this subversion is really neat. We know that in the previous parable in chapter 18, Jesus is talking about prayer and the need for being persistent in prayer. He talks about a widow who takes her case to a judge to be heard. But in this story, verses 9 to 14, this Pharisee and the tax collector go up to the temple at the hour of prayer, and they pray. The Pharisee, rather pompous, prays his prayer. The tax collector beats himself in the chest and says, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." Jesus says that guy went home to his house justified. Now, that may not sound like much to us because Jesus Christ changed how the world thinks about humility. The ancient world didn't think well of humility. They thought it was a sign of weakness. Jesus elevates humility and thinking of other people. So what's being subverted is the religious elite against the Haaretz, like a tax collector whose testimony would not even be accepted in a court of law. And so Jesus says, oh no, you've got it all wrong. Taking a shot at the Pharisees, there was a reason they crucified Jesus. And that was partly why. The Pharisees were greatly respected, very popular with the people of Jesus' day. In fact, Josephus tells us, the Jewish historian, that there were 6,000 of them in Jesus' day. They were laymen, they had jobs and tasks, but they also were very respected theologians, I guess you'd say, and religious elite. And by Jesus taking a Pharisee, we tend to think, oh, these guys must have been terrible. I mean, they must have carried, machine guns in their violin cases and ate at Greasy Spoon restaurants and wore trench coats and stuff because they killed Jesus. Yes, that's right. Religious people killed Jesus. Let's let the record show. If we're religious, we may want to think about that. But my point is simply that Jesus, by inverting these, subverting these, shows a whole new way to the kingdom. So, common images, uncommon connections, if you will. Now, very quickly, I want to just mention some other purposes that come alongside. These are the main ones if I was going to list them. But I want to mention some other things that parables do. So I'm going to create kind of a new list over here. That parables also are used by Jesus to reveal and conceal. To reveal and conceal. In that very strange sermon on parables in Matthew 13, also recorded in Mark 4, also recorded in Luke 8. Jesus tells several parables. In Matthew's account there are 8. Mark and Luke don't have quite that many. He tells the parable of the sower and the soils, and then the disciples come to him and say, why do you talk like this? We're not used to this kind of teaching. We're used to more propositional stories, I guess. So propositional things, I should say. And so why do you teach in this method? And Jesus says to them, well, he says, I'll tell you what, here's why I do it. And he quotes a passage from Isaiah 6, and he says, I tell parables, and this is very important, very important. He says, I tell parables so that people won't understand. Now, Let me get this straight, Jesus. You tell these stories so people won't understand. In Matthew's account of this, he uses a little word in Greek called hoti, which means because. So I tell parables because people don't understand, and so I put a little, salt and pepper with this story thing, and then they get it. That makes sense. But in Mark's gospel, it uses the Greek word hina, which means so that or in order that. I tell parables so they won't understand. And this seems like a very odd thing. Won't understand. What do you mean they won't understand? Well, here's the way I'd say it. It's a matter of deceiving people. I mentioned Soren Kierkegaard. Deceiving, if you will. Deceiving people into truth. Jesus does want to reveal the Father's will for us, but He does it in a concealing way. You see, in parable study, only the interested survive. If you're not willing to kind of dig back through the curtain and the veil, you'll never get it. So Jesus tells these stories not only to subvert, but also to reveal/conceal. To those who accept His message, they'll understand it. To those that further reject it, it'll be just like apocalyptic literature. It'll be like a bunch of symbolism that they don't understand. Well, there's another purpose for which He tells these stories, and I think I would just say He does it to engender, maybe a way to say it would be their memory. That's probably the best way. Engender their memory. One great thing about the parables is you can remember these stories. For years people have said, the things I remember about sermons and lessons are the illustrations, the story element. Jesus, we probably would have forgotten it if He'd have said, well, the Hebrew word for neighbor is, but we'll never forget, and a man went from Jerusalem down to Jericho and fell among thieves. So sometimes it's to enhance memory. Let me give you a third purpose of what these stories will do. Sometimes they are intended by Jesus, a little bit different than in the ancient world, to persuade of a certain viewpoint. I'm thinking right now of Matthew 21, verse 45. Jesus tells a parable there on the day of questions of His final week. And I love verse 45 of the 21st chapter of Matthew when it says, now the Pharisees perceived that He was telling this parable against them. It's like the light bulb comes on above their head. They finally get it. And this is what's kind of interesting, is that sometimes the outsiders understood the stories of Jesus better than the insiders. The disciples had to come to Jesus more than once and say, that story about the weeds and the wheat, we didn't get that. Can you run that by us one more time? What are you talking about? Well, Jesus will use this to persuade, and it evidently worked because they understood it. Here's a fourth one, and that is to fulfill prophecy. That shouldn't surprise anybody, I suppose, that Jesus would tell stories to fulfill what the prophet said. The prophet said, even in the book of Psalms, it says that when the Messiah comes, He will utter forth stories, and literally the Greek word is, and He'll belch forth these stories. So he spoke in parables because it was prophesied that when the Messiah came, that's how this guy would talk. And then finally, one other one is, and this is kind of interesting, we can develop this a little bit more. I think that these parables lay claim to His deity. They lay claim to His deity in a very, once again, subtle way, almost subversive way. Matthew 22, He'll say, a king was going to throw a banquet and a wedding for his son. Well, man, I mean, that's pretty obvious what's going on there. Who is it that has an only son that the king's going to throw a banquet for? Or, the fact that the son in the parable of the vineyard, that the tenant farmers have killed the servants sent to get some of the produce. And He says, I will send my son. They will respect my son. Instead, they kill him. Here's the question. Does Jesus write Himself into His own stories? I think sometimes He does. Maybe we have to allegorize to get there, but I think sometimes He probably does. He subverts the world. He conceals the truth so that only in parable study the interested survive. These are some of the functions and the purposes of parables.